Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We got a great one to kick off today. We got Michol Dalcourt. For those who don't know Michol is the founder of Institute of Motion, as well as he's the founder of Viper Pro. Michol's been presenting for us. I think Michol, it's now been about 17 years now, I think, maybe
Gotta be
16.
close. Yeah, gotta be
Close to
close.
17 years. I met Michol a long time ago when he was the co-founder of PTA Global. Short little story before we kick you off, Michol, that a good friend of mine actually called me up one day and he said, "I know this Canadian guy. He's a farmer from Canada, but this guy is sharp as hell, and you got to follow him. You got to hear what he has to say." And sure enough, he led me right to Michol. And I tell people that when it comes to human movement, Michol, there's no one that's sharper than you on this subject or smarter than you. I think you have it dialed in. I think you spent a career of dialing in on human motion and finding better ways to train for motion, including and obviously in sport. But we got a good one today here with the critical phase of evidence-based training. It's a pleasure for me to present Michol Dalcourt.
Yeah, listen, Chris, I just want to throw out a big, huge, thank you to you, the entire team at Perform Better. Your dedication to, just engaging in substance, right? Information that is actionable for people has through the years been extraordinary. And so, as a presenter that has shared the stage with you for, 16, 17 years, on behalf of all the presenters that present, on your summits and through your network, we just owe you a huge debt of gratitude. Your commitment to this is just singular, and it means a lot to us. And so I just want to throw out a big thanks to the Perform Better team, all of them, good heads, good hearts, and wonderful to be part of this conversation today. Thank you for allowing me an audience to be able to share this idea of anatomical adaptation, what it really means. Now, we can put this into context for the idea of athletes, or we can put this into context for just regular folks. When we study mesocycles or periodization models, what we are trying to do, obviously, is to introduce stressors that allow proper adaptations for an individual, whether that's an elite athlete or, a recreational athlete or a general individual, so that they can actually have some sort of improvement physiologically, so that they can play or engage in their activity in meaningful ways, right? High level athletes, obviously, they want to be available, they want to perform at the highest level. If you're an aging person or you've got a client who's an aging person and they want to be viable, right, as a solution for movement, they want to play with their grandkids and they just don't want to get injured, that's also equally important. And so, what I want to talk about today is some elements around preparation, preparatory phases. Think about general preparation in the anatomical adaptation phase. And so, when I first learned about periodization back in the Tudor Bompa days in Canada, there was this kind of idea of athletes, right? Off season, you've got this idea of prep. So, in the early phases of off season, you've got what's called an anatomical adaptation phase. That dovetails into strength as a phase, then to power, then the expression of power, SAQ, then into your sport. So general preparedness would be the analogy of a car, right? So if strength is the second phase, and strength is expressed as, or at least defined as, the ability for our body to produce a force. Well, what's important in producing a force? Well, the nervous system has to do a bunch of things. The muscular system has to do a bunch of things. Force transfer proteins like the fibrous connective tissue, the fascial system, the tendons, they got to do a bunch of things. The joints have to do a bunch of things to be able to express meaningful force. Cool. Let's analogize that as the engine of a car, right? So if you're revving the engine and that engine is your strength, then what supports strength is the chassis of your car, right? And the chassis of the human being is largely force transfer proteins, largely it's collagen, and that's in the skin, in the fibrous connective tissue system. That's going to be the chassis. So if you build a chassis that's strong enough to accommodate a revving engine, that's a pretty darn good place to put our mindset in terms of how we might want to approach anatomical adaptation. Can we build a robust system in the body so that it can tolerate the demands of strength and power and everything else? And so, what we tend to look at is we look at what is best when we think about preparatory. And the early phases of preparatory periods would be general preparation phase. And that's where I want to shine a light for this conversation today. And I really want to kind of get clear on what sort of strategies we can bring to bear. I've got around an hour. I'm probably going to take, 50 or 55 minutes or so to delineate this. I'm not going to go into great detail on every facet. We don't have the time for that. What I'd rather do is just lay out almost a story-like scenario for us to get our heads around what's important and a couple of conceptual ideas, talking about different systems in the body. Then I want to get right to some actionable steps. How do we put this into practice? What sort of theories and concepts and kind of outlines may be important, right? Can we anchor into some fundamental strategies and some, kind of actionable outlines? With that, if you have any questions throughout, just put them in the chat functionality. At the end of my little talk here, I'm going to go into the Q&A. I'm going to read some questions and then answer them. And then I want to be as respectful of time as possible. If we do run over, I'm prepared for that. If you've got to jump, this is being recorded. So, you can certainly follow up at that point. But what we want to do is kind of delineate this in a story-like manner. And so if we look at the aspects of a decision tree around strength. Now, remember, we're talking about how to develop this idea of prerequisites to strength. How do we build a strong chassis of our body? The best way that I know how is to kind of take a look at farm kids, right? We all know that farm kids are strong, but they're also pretty darn resilient. What they do is they tend to be very strong in different positions. They're very stable. They're very resilient and tolerant to the demands of life, and they decrease the risk of injury. And largely what they do is movement-based approaches to strength. They very rarely go in a gym scenario if you're on the farm doing chores like generations ago, and they don't really isolate muscles. So there is a muscle-based approach to strength, and there is a movement-based approach to strength. Now, both of them are awesome and important and certainly valuable to consider. But they are, however, somewhat different in their outcomes. And they do anchor to different strategies and different concepts. So muscle-based strength is typically your bodybuilding type of scenario. Your goal there is to try to increase cross-sectional area of the muscle. Is some correlation between size of muscle, cross-sectional area, and the ability for it to produce a certain amount of force. So that's valuable. We can certainly take that approach. So things like time under tension, an overload of a specific area of the body to fatigue, localizing stress, mostly in a known plane of motion like sagittal plane, so we can really load the system effectively. Going through a full range of motion, including at length, which may be the most growth-inducing phase of the contraction. And we want to create muscle damage. We want to create a histamine release. And that histamine release, which is inflammation, really triggers the satellite cell activity for growth, right? So then we grow. All of that is really good. And all of that is vital when we want to think about muscle-based strength and growth, hypertrophy. On the other side of the equation would be muscle-based strength. And this is organized so that we can take a look at the entire system for athleticism, whether you're a high-level athlete or a general clientele just wanting to move better. We anchor to different concepts, right? So think about bodybuilding as bodybuilding. Not a lot of bodybuilders at the Olympics, rightfully so. Doesn't mean that bodybuilding is bad, doesn't mean the Olympics is better. It means they're different. And so if we think about athletes, say at the Olympics, they look at things like, yes, cross-sectional area to a certain point. They look at integrated task-based muscle function, right, which is a nervous system to muscle conversation. They look at pulsing stiffness, right? This idea of rate of relaxation, limb velocity, high velocity nerve conduction. They look at responsive remodeling, like an elastic recoil that is in the fascial system. They look at integrated motor control through the entire structure of the body. They look at dynamic systems theory, like how the body self-organizes to different tasks and different movement patterns. And then they look at force production under certain conditions, deadlifting and dead shifting, odd position strength, agile strength profiles. So they anchor to different ultimate goals. And this is important because a lot of times when we think about anatomical adaptation, we are going to lean on concepts that are more in the movement-based strength conversation, right? The concepts that underpin movement-based strength. So with that kind of decision tree, or at least that perspective on two types of, ways to address strength, what I want to look at is how do we set the foundation of preparation, right? This anatomical adaptation through various different systems of the body. I'm not going to go into huge detail, but I want to anchor into some fundamental aspects within muscle, within nerve, within skin, within the joints, and within fascia. And I'm ending with fascia on purpose because fascial remodeling really is the chassis of a person's body. And if we can kind of create more in adaptation in the force transfer proteins of the body, right, which are collagen and fascia, then that's going to set up a good network of structure within the body, compounds, right? In this case, type 1 collagen, that really is kind of like your weightlifting suit. And we all know that if I wear a weightlifting suit that's more shape stable, right, it's more supportive, I can generate more force and I can be safer, and my joints can be more, under the constant omnidirectional uh, patterns of pre-stress, right? They're more stable. So I'm ending with fascia on purpose, but muscle, nerve, skin, joints, and fascia. How do we set them up? And the first one is muscle. We know that muscle has four properties, extensibility and elasticity. It also has excitability and contractility. And so the ability to contract and excite through a motor system is going to be important. It is also elastic, so we can go to a stretch, which is going to be important when we think about, in a moment, when we think about fascia, the body's ability to, or the muscular system's ability to go long is going to afford us the ability to go at end range. That's going to be super useful because now at end range, our fascia can to benefit from a certain degree of, or a certain type of loading parameter. What we want in through the muscle is we want, as we set the preparation foundation, we want motor control, particularly of type 1 motor units. Type 1 motor units are basically slow to fatigue, they're slow oxidative, they're typically close to a joint. They're the ones that stabilize the joint dynamically. And the nervous system kind of calls upon these motor units to be successful. So think about your rotator cuff or your deep lateral rotators of the hip. These are all deep stabilizing systems that get triggered with the nervous system. If we can triangulate our load, and if we can teach or expose our joints to different physiological motions within their normal physiology, right? We're not oddly loading them, but within their normal physiological parameters, then we're going to expose the body's ability to tolerate those positions and to get proficiencies within the nerve and the muscle, right? So we think about this idea that we want the muscle to achieve contraction. We want it to be able to go long. We want to feed the nervous system with the right information so that we can create the awareness of muscle functioning essentially in all three planes of motion. And that's going to be very, very important. So the idea of going long in our load is part of this equation. And we're going to get into some strategies here in a moment. The nervous system is bathed, the muscular system is bathed by nervous input. So when we think about motor control of the muscle, we have to talk about the nervous system. So think about threat. If I'm walking on ice, right? As a Canadian, I live in San Diego now, but as a Canadian, half the year we're walking on ice. And every time you walk on ice, there is threat. There's increased instability. And when there's threat, the body reflexively guards itself and keeps everything tight and short. And that goes against one of the strategies that we're going to talk about today, which is how do I go long under load so that I can create the strong chassis of the body that I want. And so the idea here is that I want to be able to remove a certain degree of threat and instability, and I want to increase motor control. In preparation, I want to expose my body to a wide variety of different joint positions. And that's going to be part of the preparatory strategy. So can I go and move with different loads at different speeds with different angles? Remember that. Different loads with different speeds at different angles. That becomes a loading parameter or a concept that we hold very near and dear to the general preparation of anatomical adaptation. It doesn't mean that I'm using super heavy weights or complex motor tasks. I just want to expose different speeds with different loads at different angles. Three-dimensionally, certainly at the shoulder joint, three-dimensionally, certainly at the hip joint, three-dimensionally, certainly at the foot and ankle joint is some of the things that we can do. You're going to see evidence of that in some of the exercises that you're about to see here. So we want to be able to facilitate that. Another strategy in what you're seeing here is by doing and exposing movements at different speeds, different loads at different angles, what you're seeing here is ways in which the nervous system can get more efficient. So the nerve on the right has those sausage links that you see. Those are going to be basically myelinated sheaths, right? Insulated sheaths that are due to the adaptive process. And when we myelinate the axon of a nerve based on exposure to movement, right? That's one of the adaptations to the nervous system. You get these sausage links. And once you have them, what happens is you have the possibility of higher nerve conduction. Because normally what a nerve will do is the nerve impulse will crawl along that line, like you see on the left nerve, and it crawls nice and slow along that line, and it transmits at a certain pace. But once we get the myelination in the axon, like the terminal end of the neuron, then what happens is we can actually jump from each of the gaps of that sausage link, and it jumps the nerve impulse jumps from gap to gap to gap. Those nodes are called the nodes of Ranvier, and the transmission speed goes way up. So the take-home message here is the more sausage links I have, the more potential I have to transmit quickly. Now, that doesn't just help the elite athlete. That helps me at 95 years old when I'm falling into the ground and I want to react quick. So that's all about longevity. It's all about a youthful nervous system. And it's about, let's say, motor acuity. Like, can I have motor acuity that I can send a signal fast? Different speeds, different loads at different angles will create an adaptation through time that puts more sausage links in my axon. So that's useful, right? And so there's nervous system adaptation that can control the muscle with greater speed and greater, let's say, motor control. Another one is the skin. Now, you might not think that skin is important to training because nobody thinks Monday in the gym is skin day, but it does adapt to loading as well, right? Because it does follow the product of mechanotransduction, which simply means if you load the skin with force, with mechanical load, it will remodel cellularly. And the best way to do it is to stretch it, right? So if you stretch skin, it's going to facilitate a remodeling along the line of stress. So that's useful because skin, if it's conducting or if it's acting like a young skin, it's going to have a lot of shape stability. Think about it this way. Mother Nature is very clever. She would not put the heaviest organ that we have, which is the skin, on our bodies and have the skin contribute nothing to movement. That would be a penalty for the bones of the body, the skeletal system, the muscles of the body, if it had to carry the skin around for the lifetime, and that skin had no contribution to movement at all. But in reality, skin does contribute to motion. It's elastic, so it does recoil when you stretch it. And if it's nice and young and taut, right, it's shape stable, then it's going to provide a weightlifting suit outside the body. Think about when we get older. Like the skin behaves very differently when we're older, right? So if you take grandma's or grandpa's skin, give it a tug, and you let it go, it ain't going anywhere for a long period of time. So what it's lost, the elastin, which is a fiber, reticulin, which is a fiber, and collagen, which is a fiber. It's lost all those fibers in the skin when we get older. And it behaves differently. It starts to droop and sag and creates less shape stable systems within our body. So we lose stability. Now, skin's not the only thing that stabilizes our body, but it is a contributor. And if we lost the contribution of skin as a structure that can stabilize us, then the muscles have to do more, the nervous system has to do more, they're more upregulated, the muscles stay on for longer, there's more tightness in the body. Our gait and our expression of motion isn't at end range anymore because we lost the end range ability. All of that kind of sounds like an old person, doesn't it? And so while it's not the only thing that matters, it does contribute. And so by the skin at end range, right? Different speeds with different loads at different angles at end range, we're going to put a stress force or a stretch force on the skin. That stress, which is a stretch, is going to allow the skin to remodel and pack more collagen. Collagen is very shape stable. It's going to create a more taut skin and it's going to behave like younger skin. And that's going to be important. Not the only thing that's important, but it's going to be important. That increases rather shape stability in the body. The way it does that is through mechanotransduction, which simply says that if you load it, fibroblast activity are going to release collagen along the lines of stress. That collagen is going to remodel and get glued down and at a microscopic level produce very strong and young looking skin. And that's what everybody wants. Joints, we want to make sure that the joints can articulate to get to end range, right? Because if they can't get to end range, then we can't get the muscles, we can't get the nervous system, we can't get the skin to behave in the right ways in order for them to achieve the right loading parameters so that those valuable inputs can necessitate the proper supercompensation, the adaptations that occur. So we want to make sure that we've got good joint expression and that it can be centrated, right? The joint right place at the right time. And so again, if we expose different speeds with different loads at different angles, and we can clear mobility at key joints, we're going to ensure that we can centrate the joint, which basically means the joint occupies an instantaneous optimal axis of rotation. Essentially, it's at the right place at the right time, and it's never out of position like you see on the right-hand side of this slide, which then a bone is going to knock into another bone, and that's not a good idea. So we want to maintain an optimal, instantaneous axis of rotation, right? The joint can just move freely with the adjacent joints, and they're kind of doing this dance together. So think about taking your shoulder all the way up, right? It's not just your humerus that's going all the way up. It's the glenoid fossa and blade that's also moving in a 1-to-1 or 1-to-2 ratio with the shoulder blade, right? So I'm moving my arm up, my arm comes up, my humerus comes up, the shoulder blade comes back and down, so it posteriorly tilts and depresses to get out of the way so that the joints can move. Good thing, we want to be able to clear that motion, and so we express that motion in proper ways. Finally, with general preparation and fascia, we want to be able to create strong fascial behavior. This is the connective tissue that is around all the organs, all of the muscle bundles, right? The outside of the muscle, every muscle bundle, and even every muscle fiber, the myofibril, is wrapped within this connective tissue structure. And then the tendons are made up of that. The ligaments are made up of that. The aponeuroses of the body are made up of that. So it's basically the big connector of everything in our body. And so it behaves very differently, right? So if we get adhesions to the fascia, we'll never get to end range. One kind of element of mention here is advanced glycation end products, which are AGEs, will cause adhesions. AGEs will increase stiffness, reduce flexibility, and lead to potential pain, right? AGEs can significantly impact fascia and how fascia moves around. We want it to be dynamic to a certain point. It needs to be tense and stiff, but it needs to be compliant enough to move around, right? It can't be like felt. And so we want to be able to kind of have that behavior within fascia. If we have a bunch of these AGEs within the fascial network, then it inhibits the fascia from moving dynamically and behaving correctly. Where we get AGEs is actually from a lot from the diet, right? So if you overcook food and you brown it, you're going to release a lot of AGEs. If there is a lot of sugar in your diet that's refined, you're going to release a lot of AGEs. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that, and if you want to research this, please do, right? Because I'm not going to go into that much detail, but put advanced glycation end products and fascial behaviors into whatever search you want and look at it. It's going to limit how your fascia behaves to the detriment of movement, right? So just be aware of that. The next thing is that fascia is made up of a bunch of cells that have a bunch of fibers that are sent out into the extracellular matrix within fascia. And then water is either bound to it or it's free floating. And we want to have bound water, and I'll explain why. So if I start to stretch with different speeds, with different loads at different angles, and you're going to see video of this in a moment, then what happens is I start to get a lot of stretch. And when there's stretch, the fascia begins to deform, which is a good thing. When it deforms, it depolarizes and it sends a bunch of fibroblasts to that area, that line of stress. And those fibroblasts release collagen. And that collagen is sent out along that line of stress. And collagen is a kind of a triple helix. It's, this wound up, coiled piece of protein. And it can get tangled up with an adjacent collagen to provide exquisite shape stability. So in other words, your body can build stability with the blocks of collagen all getting tangled up with one another. And that leads to a network body-wide of a very robust, very sturdy, and stable system. That's what we want. So when farm kids did their chores, guess where their lines of stress were? It wasn't just in the sagittal plane, it was in every plane of motion possible because they had different speeds with different loads at different angles. And when they remodeled based on those loading parameters, they sent collagen all over the body in every angle. And that knit a three-dimensional kind of weightlifting suit, right? Or three-dimensional kind of spider web that added a lot of shape stability. And so when you wrestle a farm kid, even though the gym kid may be more muscular, most people's money is on the farm kid still because they have all of this shape stability because they've got all this protein, this collagen being packed in different ways so that now there's more stable. Now there's more pre-stress and stability. Now the nervous system says, hey, we're more stable. We can produce more force, right? So all of these things start to work in conjunction with for the betterment of every system. So remember, the cells, fibroblasts, will remodel collagen along lines of stress. The question is, what are we stressing? What lines? You'll see evidence of that in just a moment. That's a collagen. It's a triple helix. It's an amino acid that is, coiled. The longer they are, the more strength they give to the body. Another term for collagen, you might hear it, is a force transfer protein. The more force transfer proteins we have in the body, the more force can transfer from a muscle to a bone and to the outside world. We need force transfer proteins to be strong. They did research in Europe where they gave lab rats halofunginol, which is an antifibrotic, and it denatured like 50% of their force transfer proteins. Same nerve, same muscle, same cross-sectional area of the muscle. So in other words, the muscle didn't shrink its size. And all they did was erode all of the collagen, all the tendon and kind of covering of the bone to around 50% of what it was before. The strength plummeted by 60%. So it doesn't matter how much nerve you have, you have to have the entire network. Yes, it's certainly strong, suitable to have good nervous system, very important. Good cross-sectional area of muscle, very important. And also good force transfer proteins, because all of these things are going to be important. Collagen carries a bunch of different molecules with it, and I'll make mention of a few. Glycosaminoglycans are one. Hyaluronic acid or hyaluronan synthase is another one, and lubricin is another one. And they're very hydrophilic. They suck a lot of water to them, draw a lot of water. And once there's a lot of water within the collagen network, the tendons can actually behave more athletically. So they don't get stiff, they don't get too tense. There's some degree of compliance within the tendon that makes them springy. So, Chris and I were talking about the Celtics at the start of, our talk today. And you look at the Achilles ruptures, et cetera. And part of it, I'm not saying this is for sure deterministic, but part of it is if the tendon is not compliant enough and it's too tense, then what happens is it gets too tense at the tendinous muscular junction where the muscle becomes the tendon, then goes towards the bone. That junction of muscle to tendon is typically where tears occur if there is too much tension and not enough compliance. And let's say all of these compounds that hold a lot of water with them, if they're not bathing the system, your tendons are not going to be as dynamic, and that's bad for everybody. So we want to make sure that it's being reinforced, particularly in the anatomical adaptation phase of training. We've got patterns of general preparedness, right? Our bodies remodel along lines of stress. So I'll say this again: different loads with different speeds at different angles is going to be one of the key concepts that you're going to see in all the exercises that I'm about to show you. So these trabecular patterns, these fascial strain patterns, it's all going to be remodeled along lines of stress. If all I do is one dimension of training, I'm going to get a preponderance of remodeling in one dimension, right? But we all know that life, sport, our anatomy is all multi-directional. It's laid down like a three-dimensional spider web. So we want to have our loading parameters consistent with that morphology. How it lays it down is, like I said before, the fibroblasts, right, are signaled with lines of stress. They start to remodel. We want enough stress in the system to have that green line appear, right? We want optimal training. If all I do is sit around and I never introduce stress at length in the body, you get the bottom arrow, right? Insufficient challenge. Think about it this way. You might have clients or athletes, or maybe not athletes, but clients certainly, or individuals that that sit too much. That's the bottom arrow. Insufficient challenge will create fibrosis and irregular fiber arrangement, because again, fibroblasts will go to where the line of stress is and they'll remodel along that line of stress. So that's a very organized approach to remodeling. But if there's no mechanical input to tell the system where to remodel, it just starts to irregularly remodel anywhere. And that starts to look like felt. And as you know, felt is very it's not responsive and it's not dynamic. It's just stuck. It's gluey, it's gunky, it's fibrotic. We don't want our system to be that. So insufficient challenge, you'll get fibrosis, you'll get irregular fiber arrangements, you'll get a thickening of the perimysium, which is the inner bundle covering, and then you'll have increased advanced glycation end products and cross-linking. The whole thing is going to mess with the dynamism of fascia. So we don't want that. We want to move. If we move, just at a bare minimum, right? The minimal dosage. That's the second line or arrow up. It's status quo maintenance, which is we're not getting any better. We're not getting any worse. We're not making improvements. It's kind of you synthesize certain things and it degrades. You synthesize and it degrades. And the net result is status quo. What we want is a wave of fatigue initially, and then a recoil of supercompensation and adaptation so that there is an appropriate adaptation over time that occurs. When we bring about a challenge to the body, we create a well of fatigue, which is that green line dipping down. That's the well of fatigue. If we have the suitable recovery between, that's going to be the regeneration period where it actually goes and supercompensates. And we're going to see that appropriate challenges will supercompensate in an upward trend over time. And that's optimum training and optimum adaptation. We want to be able to see this in the anatomical phases of training so that we can build a robust chassis of our body so it can meet the demands of life and sport. So that's optimal training. If we're overtraining and overloading, then we're creating too much inflammatory cytokines. So, interleukin 6, to a certain degree, interleukin 10. These are interleukins, which are inflammatory cytokines that are just running rampant. And with chronic elevation of inflammation, you get a lot of irregularity in terms of edema, fibrosis. You're starting to get too much type 3 collagen, not enough type 1. It's just the system is now too activated, too inflamed. and it's breaking down and not optimizing its remodeling because of too much of a good thing, right? There's too much overreaching occurring. So we want to be able to remodel effectively. I'm not going to quite go into this slide in too much detail. Suffice to say, the system remodels along lines of stress. Different speeds with different loads at different angles is going to optimize remodeling. Bunch of research for you. Don't have to dig into it too much unless you want to take a picture of this and go into it and have a real geek out session if you want. But if we remove tensile load from a tendon, it results in smaller cells. By cells, it's collagen. Collagen shrinks, right? There's collagen, there's less cells, excuse me, there's more cells itself, less size of cells, right? So they start to kind of just remodel like felt, and there's less directionality of the collagen. So would you like your Achilles tendon to be oriented towards, the ability for you to plantar flex load well, or to be laid down like felt where it doesn't react to a stretch and it cannot shorten? Obviously, we wouldn't want the latter, right? We want the former, which is it can recoil and stretch with high degrees of athleticism and dynamism so that it can achieve an outcome of high degrees of bounciness, if you will. So removing tensile load results in more cells, smaller collagen, not good, less directionality, not good. So we want to load the system. Load and tensile strength is different speeds with different loads and different angles. You're going to see evidence of this in just a moment. Another one is inactivity will increase tendon stiffness due to loss of compliance near the muscle. So remember when I said, the rupture of an Achilles tendon, let's say, as an example, is typically at the musculotendinous junction. Why? Because it's increasing its stiffness. So tendons need to be appropriately stiff, but also some degree of compliance. They need to stretch. And if they're too stiff, it's going to rupture at the adjacent segment, right where the tendon meets the muscle. And that's typically what we see. So we want to, avoid that. If we stretch it, it's going to be tensile loading, a lot of type 1 collagen. If we squash different areas, it's going to be a lot of, type 2 collagen, which is like the disc of your spine, the pubis symphysis of your belly. And that's going to be a very good shock absorption pad, right? And then there's shear, which is kind of type 1, type 3. And that's where lubricant is really going to increase. So here's the thing. I'm going to show you a stress relaxation protocol in a second. So it's going at end range, right? Different speeds with different loads at different angles, going to an end range, holding that end range isometrically for about 10 seconds. When that happens, you have an isometric contraction in the muscle and you get slow, what's called fascial creep, which is a slow deformation in the fascial layers. So if you look at my hands, if they start gliding over nice and slowly, that's called creep. And when you have that, each one of these kind of overlap, these layers sliding against one another, you increase a compound within each of the layers called lubricant. And lubricant has a lot of water to it. And that is a wonderful thing, because what you're going to teach those tendons to do is be dynamic, because they can shear against each other without disruption to the behavior of that tissue. So remember that. You want to get lubricant in between each layer of the tendon or the fibrous connective tissue. I'm going to show you exactly how to do that as a measure of anatomical adaptation. The other one is going long under load, right? So if you think about long under load, there's an expression of an enzyme called lysyl oxidase, and that enzyme increases the collagen cross-linking. That's what we want. We want to get collagen to be long. We want to express it and send it out into the extracellular space. Then we want to get it to bind to an adjacent collagen to knit ourselves a weightlifting suit. And the knitting is the lysyl oxidase. That's the stuff that knits collagen together. It's expressed 10 times more when you go under length. So again, different speeds with different loads at different angles to an end range. You're going to see all of this in a moment. Lysyl oxidase, hugely important, right? It links collagen together and provides more shape stable systems of the body. And what it does, as you see with this video here, it starts to knit a weightlifting suit around the body. Critically important, particularly in general preparation, right? So the next question is, now that we know this, and we know that all of these connective tissue systems around the muscle itself, each division of the muscle is important. We know that these things kind of bind and weave together, both phasic and tonic-based structures. You see the collagen in blue there, the muscle in red. When we know all of this, what do we do because of it? How do we get a pre-stressed, tension-based system, right? How do we get a tension-based system that can absorb and distribute energy, that can distribute mechanical load into the kinetic chain, that can strengthen and maintain joint stability? Because all of this stuff is really the hallmark and the foundation of anatomical adaptation. So what do we do because of this, right? So we've kind of went through the theory. Now what I'd like to do is take some moments now and think about the recipe and the strategy on what we do. There are two things that we can do. We can do an intramuscular loading. So this idea of submaximal omnidirectional loading, right? Can I take a load and can I send it out into different speeds, different loads at different angles? And that would be one way to do it. Taking the intramuscular myofascial tissue and going to an end range and holding it would be more of what's called stress relaxation. And Dr. Keith Barr from UC Davis does a lot of this research, and he's developed some protocols that we use quite a bit. And it's really about isometric holds for 10 seconds, and I'll explain exactly what happens. And that is really a way to get the tendons and ligaments, i.e. the force transfer proteins, to remodel and become more dynamic through that lubricin and hyaluronic synthase and all of these types of compounds that will actually bathe the structure and get it to behave more athletically. So there's two ways in we can do that: intramuscularly, which is more dynamic, and then tendon and ligament, which would be more holding the end range. So the cues would be maintain length in the spine, initiate the actions from the hip complex, and if your arms are reaching, reach with the shoulder blade, not just the arms, because the shoulder blade is going to carry the lats, the thoracolumbar fascia. It's going to stretch all of those adjacent tissues, which we want, right? So maintain length in the spine, move from the hips, reach with the scapula. We want to see most of the motion come from the foot and ankle complex, the hip complex, and the thoracic spine. So let's get into it. So we can look at a few movement patterns here. And again, these are going to be at end range, and they're going to be in different patterns of motion. So an example might be I take a wide position with my feet, and I've got a wide hold of, in this case, the Viper Pro, or whatever implement I want to choose. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set myself into a position where I get to an end range and then I pause, right? So if I'm doing the dynamic intramuscular approach, I would dynamically get there at end range, so different speeds, different loads at different angles to an end range, and then it would dynamically come back to my start position. If I was going to do stress relaxation, I would get to this position right here. I would pause and hold for 10 seconds. What I could also do in this position is my lead foot, which is my right foot, I can actually lift my heel off the ground and hover my heel off the ground for that 10 seconds. So now my hip is being moved and loaded in a certain phase of a lateral lunge. I got my hands to the side and overhead. I've got my heel of my right foot off the ground, and there's tension all over the body, right? There's tension in my Achilles tendon, in the adductors, the pelvic floor, the opposite glute, through the lats, through the shoulder complex, through my arm, my bicep, all that's going on under load. And I hold this for 10 seconds. If I do, that is called stress relaxation. And what I'm doing here is I am creating some degree of shear in all of the fascia all over the body, including the Achilles tendon. And that shear, right, that deformation, that sliding of one layer of fascia against the next layer is going to facilitate the production of lubricin and hyaluronic acid. That is awesome because that's going to create a more compliant tendon. Not so compliant that I'm energy leaking from it, but it's going to not be stiff enough that it increases the risk of injury and it makes me very bouncy as an athlete or an individual. Now, by the way, if I'm older, I lose the bounce, right? I lose that ability to slide, right? And everything's getting stiff and dried out. And, I'm not bringing the compounds into the areas that need to be in there for me to maintain springiness and dynamism. So I'm going to hold that position. Then I would come back. I would reset for about 50 seconds. Then I would go to that end range again. And I'll hold that for 10 seconds. And then after 10 seconds, and I bring the heel up, by the way, if I want my Achilles tendon as part of it. And then I reset to the starting position. So that would be in the frontal plane. If I want to make more of a transverse plane orientation, that's it right here, right? I can do it dynamically, which is more the intramuscular load of getting to the end range, getting the nervous system, getting the muscular system, getting the skin, all the advantages I spoke about before in terms of how it might adapt. And then if I want to do stress relaxation as a protocol, the same thing, but I just don't make it dynamic. I hold that end range. I can lift up my lead heel off the ground, that right heel off the ground, hover it over top of the ground. So I put some tension on the Achilles tendon and I load. This case, I'm loading the Achilles tendon, the adductor, the pelvic floor, more of the chest, right? So the pectoralis minor, especially a little bit of the major, certainly the bicep, the brachialis, the long head of the bicep, and some of the scapular muscles. I'm getting all that stretch. I'd hold for 10 seconds, then I would bring it back. I'd hold that and relax and rest for 50 seconds. Then I might go to the other side, hold that side for 10 seconds. That would be the stress relaxation. An example of the frontal plane could be I take an implement, I drive it above my head, I hold in this lateral kind of step position. I'm not really going to an end range lunge. And if you can notice, I'm driving the Viper Pro towards the camera like I'm beating down a door, right? So think about it as a battering ram. I'm just basically trying to drive through a door in front of me. When I drive this thing anteriorly to the body and maintain an overhead position, it's going to put a stretch force on the posterior chain, right? Because I'm throwing my hands forward, my posterior chain is going to get a stretch. I can actually lift my heel off the ground here, hold that forward position, and then bring it back. If I want to make it more dynamic, I just don't hold it, right? I would just move in and out of this position dynamically. So if I was to hold it, I drive that forward, as you can see here. I hold that for 10 seconds. I can lift that heel up off the ground, get tension all across the posterior chain, all across the heel. And then I would get the stress relaxation. I would start to remodel the collagen. I would start to create motor control in this joint position. Really good for the scapula, by the way, the shoulder blades and the shoulder complex for motor control, because I'm driving something forward that I got to stabilize. So all of the elements of the body, the nervous system, muscular system, the skin, the joints themselves, and the fascia are all getting positive influence of anatomical adaptation. I am setting the body up for the ability to tolerate increasing loads, right? Because I'm going through different joints, so different movements, different speeds, different loads at different angles, essentially. Another one would be more in the thoracic spine, the bicep, etc. So if I was to hold that end position, I've got a staggered stance. I'm not side flexing the spine so much as I'm abducting the hip, right? So I'm shoving the hip complex out towards my left. Then I can side lean the spine without side flexing it. So I'm not getting a lot of aberrant movement in the spine. And then I'm producing what's called a type 1 thoracic spine motion, right? So I'm taking the Viper Pro. My trail hand, my bottom hand, is lifting my lead hand up. So I'm getting a nice stretch in through the pec, the anterior shoulder girdle, the bicep, all the way through the lateral complex of the abdominal wall, all the way through the lateral complex of the hip, all the way down to the foot. So that's getting a nice stretch. With a stretch, as I said before, more lysyl oxidase, more cross-linking of collagen, all of these things. I'm knitting a weightlifting suit on the side of my body right here. And all I do with his bottom hand is I shove it out to the side to create a coupled motion in the thoracic spine so that I can be successful, right? And I'm going to achieve that load. I either do it dynamically for intramuscular efforts, or I hold the end range for 10 seconds if I want stress relaxation and I want to bring about more remodeling of force transfer proteins. So it's just another way to knit my weightlifting suit right here. So here's the recipe for stress relaxation. You basically have a hold at your end range isometrically, a 10-second hold with a 50-second rest between. If you do that 10 times, that's 10 minutes. And that's Keith Barr's protocol. That's a minimal effective dosage. The refractory period is 6 to 8 hours. And what that really means is you could theoretically do this every 6 to 8 hours, and that would be completely fine. The reality is probably most people don't have the time and the wherewithal to do this every 6 hours. So if you did this twice a week or 3 times a week, that is completely fine. And this protocol is very good as a way to set up anatomical adaptation in the early phases of periodization so that by the time you get into strength, particularly your classic strength lift, right? Your deadlifts, perhaps your squats, these types of things, then you're strong omnidirectionally in the body and you have the ability to coordinate all of the systems of the body so that they are behaving the way they should so that you can accommodate this load. And so that would be, how we go about doing this. I'm going to take maybe a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes, and I'm going to show you some other movement patterns, right? So you're going to see the dynamic version of each of these. But again, if you wanted to create the stress relaxation profiles, you would simply go in and you would hold at the end range, right? So at the end range, you would be right here. You would drop it down and you would just hold it there. Now, if I held that down for let's say, 10 seconds, you could imagine the extraordinary stress on the adductor of the trail side, the pelvic floor. By the way, could I lift this lead heel off the ground? If you can see my cursor, yes, I could. And so now you're going to put attention on the Achilles tendon, and you're going to remodel these in a way that is both dynamic, but also very tension-based. And so that's another example that, your hips are going into one direction, but your hands are going in the other. Another rotation variation, you're seeing the dynamic motion here going in and out, which is completely fine. If you wanted to add the static version, you would get nice and wide. You would get to your end range. You could well imagine how much stretch is going across the chest, the internal, external obliques, and all these individuals, or all these areas of the body, rather, that are going through it. Same thing here. Your pelvis is going in one direction, but your hands are going in opposite directions. I can hold at the end range. If you held that for 10 seconds, lifted this heel off the ground of the lead leg, you're going to have tension all across the structure, and that's going to afford and accommodate the remodeling that is necessary to create the right architecture in the body. Right? Again, we can do it in a variety of different patterns. Here you see a kneeling version to get the anterior hip, particularly in the groin, right? So the groin gets injured a lot because it lacks dynamism. Why? Because a lot of people sit too much. And when you sit too much, you get a reflexive shortening, not just in the muscle, but all the collagen in the anterior compartment of the hip. So the next time you go and do, let's say, forceful extension, let's say you're sprinting, your anterior hip is not that dynamic, right? It's not that bouncy. And so what happens is it gets tight. And when we talked about before, the tightness, particularly in the tendinous areas, is going to expose injury at the musculotendinous junction, right? Because the tendon is not compliant enough to be springy and dynamic. And so you pull a muscle, right? Or you have a musculoskeletal injury, which more specifically, 88% of the time, it's of the soft tissue. It's the fibrous connective tissue at the junction between the tendon and the muscle. That's where it ruptures most of the time, not all the time. But research will say around 88% of the time, that's where it happens. And so we want to create that dynamism. So I can go to end range, hold that position, and then come back, right? So all of these strategies are useful in terms of how we might set up the system to go through different loads with different speeds at different actions so that we can accommodate adaptations that are anatomical adaptations to build the chassis of our vehicle, right? So that we can load it appropriately. Because remember, the next phase after anatomical adaptation is strength. And the next phase after that is the expression of strength, which is power, right? Think of power as strength expressed, and that is at speed with high velocity. So if we want velocity, we want to be able to build up force transfer proteins to accommodate a high degree of force output based on time. So the rate of force is power. So that gives you a little bit of basis for the structure of periodization, why general preparedness and anatomical adaptation is useful to consider, what we need to look at in terms of muscle, nervous system, skin, joints, and fascia when we're thinking about building the base of our system, like the chassis of our car. And then you saw two ways to do it. You saw a dynamic way, which is an intramuscular way to get different speeds at different loads at different angles. And then you saw isometric end hold way, which is really Keith Barr's stress relaxation. And so with that, I hope what I've done in this quick hour is delineated a way in which we can take a look at the science and the tissue behavior and anchor it to a protocol and a bunch of different strategies by virtue of exercises. So with that, what I'd like to do is, if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A function and I'll read them. And then we'll go through these particular questions, kind of one at a time. So the first is, can you list the movement patterns? And so I think the question there from this anonymous attendee is, the way we would list them is sagittal dominant, frontal plane dominant, and then transverse plane dominant. We generally like an entire view of the body at once. So in other words, we don't want to localize stress. We want to kind of integrate it through the kinetic chain top to bottom as much as we can. Like you saw a kneeling version there that certainly doesn't accommodate the the lower shank of the body, the leg. But to as great a degree as we can, we want to kind of accentuate long chains of anatomy, because intermuscularly, we want those long chains to be accommodating to the load itself, right? And so that's what we want to do. We want to categorize them in planes of motion, and then we want to categorize it. Is it dynamic or is it static? And hopefully I addressed the question appropriately. Another question by Michelle is, would a 5-minute stress relaxation technique be useful as well instead of 10 minutes? So I think what Michelle's getting at here is, if I do 10 seconds on and 50 seconds of rest, but I don't do 10 sets, I do 5 sets, is there still use in this? The short answer is yes. And don't forget, if I'm a strength coach or I'm dealing with a large population base and I only have, let's say, an hour with them, and I'm saying, okay, I got to do 10 sets of this, that's 10 minutes. And I got to get to my additional warm up, and then I got to get to my entire workout. I don't have that kind of time. I think the basis of that question that you're asking is, can I shorten it? The answer is yes. You can also think about ways to use the 50 seconds of dead air to do something else that is not going to put stress into the system, but it's still part of the warm up. So in essence, if you've got 10 minutes in total for your warm up, you may sneak the stress relaxation elements into the 10 minutes without trying to steal an additional complete 10 minutes just for this stress relaxation. So consider that, but you can also consider 5 minutes as a way to kind of reduce the amount of time. And I totally get it, because you only have, if you're dealing with athletes or clients, you've got a fixed amount of time with them, and you've got a lot of good stuff to get to, right? You're not just going to get to the good stuff that I presented to today. You got a whole laundry list of good stuff that you have in it in addition to this. So I get it that, where you put this in is going to be very important. Another one by, let's see, is there any requirements for the load when doing the stretch in the video? What we want to do is think about this. A great question. Think about, you could do two ways. You can do a sub-maximal load. Think about 40% of your abilities in that dimension, right? So 40% load of your max. And when I say max, I mean the max that you could do in that plane of motion. So take 40% of that. You're going to elicit discernible changes based on Keith Barr's work, you're going to see some significant positive increase in adaptations. You can also do maximal loads, which will necessitate its own unique benefit if the person can accommodate them. And in his research, he actually did a protocol where he combined 40% load with that protocol with a maximal load, and that actually was additive in terms of its results. So I would suggest for the purposes of this call today, when you think about requirements for load, think 40%. So hopefully that addressed that question effectively. So Joe asked, what device could seniors use to start and increase load? Viper Pro looks too extreme. So if the individual wants to start with just their body weight and just their limbs reaching, that's completely fine. If they want to hang on to something, right, while they do this, that's also okay. So I can hang on to something that's stable and start to reach out to an end range. As long as I start to put some sort of distraction or stress force, right, a long under load type of force, if I can put that into the system, if I'm talking about seniors, I'm going to make them safe. I'm going to put them in a position of success, and I'm going to put them in a position where they can get to an end range, whatever that is, successfully. And if I have to give them more basic support, or they hang on to more things like a squat cage, a Smith machine, whatever, and they're reaching with just their hand or a light dumbbell, it's a good place to start. Eventually, they're not going to hang on with the other hand. They're going to go both their hands. And then eventually you can start to manipulate different types of loads. Even with a stretched out hand, remember, 40% maximal load is 40% maximal load. So, for a senior, that might just be the weight of their arm. And if they can hold that out for 10 seconds with a 50-second recovery, they're going to elicit similar adaptations because they're similar impositions of stress. So super useful questions. I appreciate you asking that. Any way we can get a link to some videos of the exercises to follow along. What you'll have the recording of this particular talk, I believe, and Chris can verify that. But if you get the recording, all of the videos will be in this recording, and then you can kind of just fast forward to whatever specific exercise you want, and then you can start to kind of follow along there. So that's a good question of clarity. Next one from Pat: is it viable to incorporate a 10-second hold bar protocol to the last rep of a set in a regular strength work? If you don't have neural fatigue in an exercise and you can accommodate a hold at the end of your set without fatigue of the muscular system or the nervous system, and you can achieve a suitable way to execute that motor task, like the joint's not going to be in an odd position, you're not going to put undue stress on adjacent tissues, then you could theoretically go through that protocol and hold it. The protocol itself, by 10 sets of 10, it's 10 sets of 10 seconds, is there to elicit enough gliding and shear and enough exposure to remodel force transfer proteins. So if you added the 10 seconds at the end of the set, it probably wouldn't be enough to elicit the response that you want to get from a shear perspective and a force transfer or remodeling perspective. But, if you tolerate it without fatigue and you can get safely there and back, you could certainly try it. And I'm wondering, Pat, if you're asking that because I don't have enough time, let's say, maybe you're asking from this perspective. I don't have enough time to be able to do that alone as a standalone. So I want to kind of incorporate it into the protocol. So if that's your case there, you're going to get some exposure to it, but probably not enough to get the adaptations that you want. So you might want to put it in a different day or part of an extended warm. Good question, though. Joshua, is a minimalist setting without Viper Pro, what is the most effective and simple tool to use for these movements? A body bar, barbell, Indian clubs, any of all? Indian club has the weight distribution, extended away from the wrist, which is okay. Just obviously makes more torque. Bars and barbells and body bars are fine as long as the load can be tolerable. Barbells might have, a moment of inertia that's too great because they're just so long. But, we're looking at any load, right? So the load that can facilitate, the remodeling that is important. And so, that's something to consider. When is it optimal to do this, before or after a workout? I would say before a workout, unless you're doing some sort of, really extensive work on rate of force production, like a power day or a heavy lifting day. Then I would put it on an alternative day. So even if you have an active recovery day, what a great time and place to put that in. So Elroy, that's what I would recommend. Before a workout, if it's not going to be too intense, probably not after a workout, simply because you're tired. You might want to put it in between workouts if you've got an active recovery day. Next one, Javier, what are the benefits? What benefits do isometrics have for basketball athletes or athletes in general? Javier, great question. So think about athleticism, right? You might not think that on the surface isometrics can transfer because it's such a dynamic activity, which athletics is or basketball is. Think about it this way. If we're thinking about general preparedness, right? Anatomical adaptation. We're not talking about velocity-based training. We're talking about setting the foundation up. Doing isometrics as a measure of foundational training is going to be important because when you hold the isometrics for 10 seconds, what you get is that shear force in each of the layers of the tendon. And when they shear, you start to bring in compounds like those aqueous compounds, right? A lot of water through lubricant and hyaluronic acid, et cetera. And once you have that compound in the tendon itself, you have the capacity to be more springy. But the way you do that is through an isometric contraction. So when you hold it for 10 seconds, here's exactly what happens. When you hold for something for 10 seconds, the muscle will slowly begin to shorten because the tendon slowly lengthens, and that's called fascial creep. So to maintain the same joint angle, right, if the tendon's lengthening, the muscle has to shorten to maintain the same joint angle. You want that because when fascial creep occurs, that's when the tendons start to slide with shear. And that's when you get a bunch of lubricant and all these other, water compounds in the layers. And that's going to accommodate more dynamic tendons in an athlete. I don't care if you're a basketball player or any athlete that needs to be springy. You want to be able to assert that behavior in the system. If you can do that as part of anatomical adaptation, man, you are setting yourself up for good tissue behavior all the way through your training map, all the way to in season if you're dealing with athletes. So that's why isometrics are important at the beginning of the phase, and they're going to help allow an athlete to achieve a very springy system. So thanks for that. Good question. Melanie, what is known about supplemental collagen to the adaptive process? I'm not aware of any research that suggests if I eat collagen, it'll actually formulate more collagen. What I am aware of is Keith Barr's protocol on vitamin C and gelatin. So taking a certain amount of vitamin C and a certain amount of gelatin has shown benefit to behavior of tendon. And all you've got to do there is search Keith Barr's tendon supplement cocktail, right? Put that into Google, right? Or vitamin C and gelatin Keith Barr supplement protocol. It'll give you the exact ratio of each. And then you might want to put that into your own, or if you're dealing with athletes, into their protocols. But I'm not aware of any research that suggests collagen itself has any way to get from the gut through the gut into the tissues itself directly. One way, by the way, is by actually brothing bone. That's another one. So gelatin and vitamin C and bone broth has shown evidence to increase, the availability into tissues. Marissa, what would be some examples of warm-up options you could sneak in the 50 seconds of rest? So anything that doesn't go long under load. So if you did, let's say, core stability, if you did, rotator cuff, if you did something that's not necessarily going long under load, you can also do some task switching, right? So if you're doing some sort of balance and coordination drills for increased coordination, you can do that. You can do quick release patterns for rate of relaxation, so excitation drills. So you might have seen things like low level amplitude where they're just moving quickly. Let's say I'm laying on my back and my legs are outstretched and they're up and they're on top of a bungee cord, right? Or cord board, a bungee cord that is anchored between two posts, right? So I'm thinking of the bands that perform themselves. You put that between two posts, and then you do some quick flutters with your legs. So you're getting hamstring functionality. We call that excitation, which is teaching the muscles to turn on and to turn off, more importantly, really quickly. So we would go through kind of four phases: fluid dynamics, small motor unit recruitment, like rotator cuff exercises, excitation, which is that flutter kick of your hamstrings, or balance and proprioceptive drills, like turning the head, getting proprioceptive demand, eye tracking, that sort of idea. Those are really useful things to do in the middle of those 50 seconds that certainly could accommodate things. So I appreciate all the questions. I'm going to actually end it off right there. I'm going to hand the mic back to Chris. And I just want to hand the mic back to Chris with huge appreciation of your attention to this subject matter, the inquiry of questions, and just the ability to kind of take the science and try to make it actionable. So, huge thanks to everyone, and obviously to you as well, Chris.
Thank you, Michelle. Great presentation today. Just a reminder to everyone that have been on before, and for those new people, and there was a few questions in there. This has been filmed. This will be on the Perform Better app. It's going to take us about a month to about 6 weeks before we get it up on there. We have to cut it down, edit it a little bit, but it will be on the Perform app. If you have not downloaded the Perform Better app, it's a free app. I think we're pushing close to 500 presentations on there. That's the home of really Perform Better education. We've actually started that in 2017. Michelle, thanks to you. This used to be the IOM app before we got it from you, but it's what it is basically it's where we store all of our education, all of our presentations. We've got presentations from summits back in 2017 to webinars to sessions we had in-house there. Like I said, there's close to 500 presentations on there from over 80 different presenters. Please feel free to check that out. It's a free app. Download that. Thanks for joining us today. We have our next live webinar we'll have with Josh Henkin. That is coming up on June 3rd. Everyone who received information on that, you'll receive that one coming out, and that's Josh and Jess. Will be back with us on June 3rd, Tuesday, June 3rd for that one that one's at 3 p.m. as well. So Michelle, thank you so much. Great presentation today. A lot of great feedback, a lot of great questions, and everyone, we appreciate you for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.